Okay, so we're going to go ahead and practice using the FishTracker tool in ArcGIS, and I'm going to walk you through a few of the steps that I use to get ready for and to do this kind of analysis. So I'm going to go ahead and start actually in Microsoft Excel because this is the starting point for all these types of analyses, and this is a simple spreadsheet of some fish locations. These are locations that I made up, but your spreadsheet will probably look very similar. So this is for a single fish. You see I've got the fish ID here, and I have coordinates for the X and the Y direction. These happen to be in UTMs, which are the easiest to work with, but if you're using a GPS, you might have these coordinates in latitude, longitude. It doesn't matter, but you've got to have some kind of coordinates so that you can make a point shapefile out of this spreadsheet. All right. And then I have the date and the time of each one of these individual locations, and they're sorted from the earliest location to the most recent location. Now, again, your spreadsheet might look a little different, and you might have more information. So for each time you locate the fish, you might record what the water temperature was and that. You can include all that too. I'm just trying to keep things simple. So what we need to do to prepare this spreadsheet to be used with the FishTracker tool is that we need to know how much time elapsed between successive locations, and we need that to be in hours. Okay, so the FishTracker tool will calculate this for us, but we have to have our data in a particular format, and I don't know what that format is, and I just prefer to do these sort of things myself. That way I can keep an eye on them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to calculate the time between successive locations, and I'm going to record that in a new field in this spreadsheet. And I'll show you a way we can do that in Excel. Let's go ahead and create a new column, and we're going to call this date underscore time. And this is going to be a combination of the date and the time. And I've done another video you can check out that talks about how to work with dates and times in Excel. Excuse me, but basically, if you have the date entered properly and the time entered properly and they're formatted properly, you can just go equals and select the date cell plus the time cell, and you'll notice my times are in military time, which is the way I would always recommend doing it. Hit return, and you see it just makes a cell which combines both pieces of information. And so this is a more precise data record of when you located the fish, right? It wasn't just on 6/1, it was on 6/1/13 at 1 in the afternoon. And so if you just double click on this, it'll copy that all the way down, double click here to make it larger, and you see that this column combines the date and the time into one piece of information. So now we're going to make this column for the time difference between successive locations, and we're going to name it T underscore DIFF underscore HRS return. Now it's very important that you name this column exactly this with this value, because the FishTracker tool is going to be looking for a column with this header on it when it determines the time between locations. So go ahead and name it with this particular value. The first one we're going to just put a 0 in because it's the first location. There's no time between locations. Now to get the time from this location, the time that elapsed between these two successive locations, all we have to do is say equals the most recent cell minus the location that came just before it, return, and you see it gives us 1.0625. That's in units of days, right? So 1.06 days elapsed between these successive locations. And if you look at the date and the time, that's right, it's just over a day. Well, we need this to be in hours, so let's take that formula and modify it to take the result and multiply by 24. And so 25 and a half hours elapsed between the first and second locations. So go ahead and double click there, copies it down, and you scan this and you see that it's correctly filled in the number of hours between each location, and that's the value that we're going to need in GIS. So save your file, and the next step is we're going to bring this file into GIS. All right, so we have launched ArcMap, and let's go ahead and make sure that our data frame is set to the UTM coordinate system. We're going to work in UTMs, makes our life a lot easier, which is cool. So let's load in that spreadsheet that we just created, which I called example fish locations. So you see it's just an Excel spreadsheet. We're going to add it. Now it's going to ask which of the worksheets in this workbook I want to open. There's only the one, so I'm going to add that one. And if I right click and open, you recognize this. This is exactly the spreadsheet that I just created in Excel. But what I want to do is turn this into a point shapefile. We've done this before. Let's do it again. Right click, display XY data. And it's smart enough to recognize that what I labeled X coordinate is the X field and what I labeled Y coordinate is the Y field. And I need to ensure that those are set to the UTM coordinate system. So let's just double check, and it's set there, and I hit OK, and I get this warning, it's fine. And you see there are my fish locations. Okay, now this is just a description. This is just showing these points. This is not a shapefile. We can't work with these. All we're doing is displaying them right now. So let's turn them into a shapefile. Let's right click on that and go to Data, Export Data. And we're going to use the layers source data. Since these are already in UTMs, we recorded them in UTMs, we displayed them in UTMs, we know they're in UTMs, so let's just use that source data. We could also use the data frame since it's the same. If the source data are in, say, the geographic coordinates, if they're in latitude, longitude, this is an excellent way to convert them so that the shapefile is in UTMs, since we know our data frame is in UTMs. At any rate, let's go ahead and give this a name. We're going to name this Fish Locations 1. Save it. OK. Do I want to add it? Yes, I do. And if you notice that color change there, you see that the new shapefile is a bunch of points that are exactly where our other points are. So we no longer require the services of our Excel spreadsheet. Let's go ahead and remove, and right click and remove. And if I look at the attribute table for this new shapefile I just created, you see it's exactly the same as before, but now it's a shapefile and it has this tdiff hours. That's perfect. That's what we need to get started with FishTracker. Now that we have our fish locations loaded into ArcGIS, we need to load in a shapefile that delineates where the aquatic portion of our study is. We need something to show where the water is so that we can show where the fish can swim, and then FishTracker is going to use that to determine where the fish can swim and consequently where their home range should go. So this is going to be the mask for our analysis. And this can come in several forms. What I have is a polygon shapefile of our area. This is pool 24 of the Mississippi River. I'll zoom to it. So you see this polygon shows where pool 24 lies, and it also is broken down by habitat. So if I right click and go to symbology, I can recolor this, and you see that we've got several different habitats which are listed here: the dam, diked, channel border, navigation channel, and so on. Zoom back to where our fish are, you can see all these different habitat types are shown here. Now all you really need is something to show where the water is and something to show where the water isn't. Okay, but having something like this, which is broken down by habitat, will be useful later when we try to assign different costs to the different habitats. So for example, if we want to say that a side channel has a higher cost because it's harder to swim through there, we need to be able to delineate where that side channel is. So this is nice, but I need it to be in raster form for the FishTracker tool to work on it. So I need to convert this to a raster. Very easy to do. We've got a tool here. It's in Conversion Tools to Raster, and I'm going to use Polygon to Raster. So we double click. I'm going to input my polygon shapefile. The value field I'm going to choose is type description. That's the names of the habitat types. I'm going to give this new raster, I'm going to create a name, and it's going to be P24 rast. I don't need to change these two defaults. The cell size I'm going to make 25. So the new raster I'm creating is going to have cells that are 25 meters on a side. I don't know of any particular value that's better, but I've been working with 25 meter cells and they seem to work very well. I hit OK, and it runs. And now this raster is underneath my polygon file, so I'll turn off the polygon file. And you can see that now we've got a raster that represents pool 24. Let me zoom to this layer. So this raster covers all of pool 24. And you see it's broken down again by the different habitat types. Now, since this is a raster, it can only store numbers. Each of these numbers relates to a different habitat type. And later on, if we want to change the cost, we'll have to go back and figure out which number is which habitat type. But right now, it doesn't matter. Zoom back to where my fish are. The important thing is that we've got a raster that we can now use as a mask to show where the fish can swim and where they cannot swim. And that's what we need for the next step. So now we've got this raster that represents the aquatic areas where our fish might go. And we need to turn that into a cost raster, which is what the FishTracker tool is going to use. Now, what is a cost raster? It is kind of what it sounds like. It's a raster that describes or predicts how costly it is to swim through different parts of the river. And the way we do that is by giving the cells of the raster a value, and that value indicates the relative costliness or the friction of moving through that cell. And so the lower a number, the easier it is to move through that cell. And so if a particular cell has a value of 1, then there's very little cost, very little friction, and it's very easy for the fish to move through that cell. But for example, if a cell has a value of, say, 10, then there's a lot of cost to swim through there. And it's very hard, and so the fish might avoid that particular area. And this is what the tool is going to use to calculate the least cost path. So if we look at the raster we have now, you see it's already got several different numbers. But these numbers, remember, they indicate different habitat types. These don't have anything to do with cost right now. So number 1 is just a certain habitat type, and number 2 is just a different habitat type. What we need to do is change the raster values to indicate the relative friction or the costliness of swimming through different parts of the river. And now we're going to do that in more detail a little bit later. What we're going to do right now is just assume that the cost is equal throughout the whole river. So basically we're going to say for this first step that the fish can swim wherever it wants. There's no cost to swimming anywhere. The fish has complete access to the whole river. Okay? And we're doing that simply because we want to keep it simple for this first run. But then in subsequent runs, we're going to play with the cost of swimming in the river, and we're going to see how that influences the fish's movement, which then is going to influence the home range that it is calculated. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this raster of the aquatic area that we have here, and we're going to reclassify it so that the entire raster has a value of 1. That means the cost is equal throughout the entire raster, and it's easy for the fish to swim throughout the entire raster. Real easy to do this. We just swing over here to the Arc Toolbox. And when it opens, then we look in the Spatial Analyst, Tools, and then we look at Reclass, and then we double-click the Reclassify tool. So the raster that we want to reclassify is this Pool 24 raster. And you see it gives us all the old values here, and we just have to fill in the new values. And so one way to do that is to just click on them. We want them to all be equal to 1. So I'm just clicking and filling in 1. And then where there's no data, we're going to keep that as no data. Down here, we give the new raster that we're going to create a name, and save it in the file, in the folder where all our other files are. I'm going to name this Cost Rast 1. And this is going to be the cost raster that we're going to use in the analysis. Save, hit OK, let it run, and there you have it. And I must have messed up because it's giving me 2 values. Okay, so I screwed that up. That's all right. Through repetition, we learn how to run these different tasks. So let's run the reclassify tool again. We're going to, hey, let's reclassify the one we just created. So the old values are 1 and 8. For some reason, I screwed up and left that 8 in there. The new values are going to be 1 and 1. Still no data. I'm going to name it Cost Rast 1B. Let this one run. And there we have it. Okay? And if I zoom to see this entire layer, you see that it's all the same color. And so the entire pool has the same cost. So the fish can pretty much swim wherever it wants to. The net effect of this is going to be that when the tool models the movement of a fish from one point to the other, it's going to want to pick the least cost path. Since all cells have the same cost, it's basically going to pick the straight line path, the straightest line it can take. It is, of course, going to have to avoid areas where there's land or it's can't cross the edge of the river. So that's our cost raster, which we can combine with these fish locations, and we can start to run the analysis with the FishTracker tool. So now we should have everything we need to run the analysis. I've zoomed out here. You see that I've got the cost raster that masks and delineates the entire study area. And I've got this point file of fish locations, and remember that these have that field that indicates the time in hours between successive locations. I'm going to save my project. I haven't been doing a good job of saving the project. And so we're ready to start the analysis, but we need to add the FishTracker Toolbox now, which we've already downloaded. I'm going to right click on Arc Toolbox and add Toolbox. And here I have saved the FishTracker and the library folder that has the tools in it. This is for ArcGIS 10.1, but they've also got it for 10.0. And when I hit open, it goes ahead and adds the FishTracker tool to my toolbox. Let's open this up. Open up each of these. And you can see that it's pretty slick. It's got these different tasks set up, but they're numbered in the order in which they need to be run. Now, you can just run this, where it says Run Analytical Processes, you can just run that and it goes through all the steps automatically. However, I haven't had any luck with this because I think you've got to have your initial data set up in a specific manner, and I don't know what it's supposed to be set up as, and I haven't had any luck. But I don't mind running them one at a time and checking the results each time I run them. So if we look at task number 1, it says table to shape with time diff. So this will take a table like the spreadsheet we have, and we'll convert it to a shapefile and add that time difference in. But again, you'll recall from earlier steps, we did that already. We calculated the time difference ourselves. We loaded in the table ourselves. We created the point shapefile ourselves. So we don't need to run that one. The next one is 2A projects points into the mask raster coordinates. So this is to ensure that your fish locations are in the same coordinate system as the cost raster. Again, we've already done that. We were just careful when we built things to put them all into the same coordinate system. If you haven't, you can run this one, but I think it's just easier to keep everything in the same system from the get-go. So that brings us to 2B, get the interior raster. And so we're going to run that, and we need to explain what the interior raster is, and you can see the explanation here. Basically, the idea is we need to make sure that all our fish locations are well within the boundaries of our cost raster. And if there are any that are outside the raster or right on the edge of this cost raster, they can cause a problem later when you're doing the least cost path and you're doing the home range analysis. And so if there are any of those points that are just outside or just on the edge, they need to be snapped, they need to be gently nudged in so that they're definitely inside this cost raster, okay? And the way the tool does that is to create what's known as the interior raster, which is going to be just like the cost raster, only shrunk just a smidge. And we're going to make the points snap to this slightly smaller raster. And if they fit inside the slightly smaller raster, then they definitely are well inside the larger raster, and that's what we need. So that's all this step is doing. It's just making sure that your fish locations are well within the cost raster. Now, I can look at mine and see that mine are going to be fine. But if I had a lot more points, I don't want to have to scan every one and do this by hand, so let's go ahead and run this. The input raster is this cost rast 1B. That's our cost raster that we're going to work with. The new raster name, we're going to give it a name, and we'll call it cost rast 1BI for interior. Hit OK. Let it run. And you can see this dark blue raster is the new raster that's created. And you see that it's just a cell layer smaller than the green. If I turn off the new raster, you see there's my cost raster, and here's the interior raster laying on top. So all we've done is made a raster that's a little bit smaller, and we're going to use that in the next step to make sure all of our points are snapped to this smaller raster. Now we've got our interior raster. Let's save the project. Let's go back to the toolbox. And the next step is step 3, snap points to mask raster. Let's run that. The file we're going to input is our point file of fish locations. These are the ones that we need to make sure that they're well within the mask. The mask we're going to use in this step and in this step only is that interior raster, that slightly shrunk raster that we just made. This is the only time you're going to use it. So we choose that one. We're going to give the new shapefile the name fish locations 1 snap. We don't need to mess with the max distance. It says that setting the workspace is optional, but I would go ahead and set that to the folder which contains all your project data. And there it goes. If you leave this blank, it's likely going to try and use your personal geodatabase as a workspace, and that sometimes causes errors. So in this tool and in subsequent tools, if it ever has the workspace option, go ahead and set that to the folder which contains all your other data. Now that we're ready, let's hit OK. Let it run, and we're done. So now we're going to add the new point shapefile that was just created. You'll recall that's named Fish Locations 1 Snap. And if you look here, well, you can see a little changes in some of these spots. These red dots, I can zoom in a little bit more here, and they're not zooming in well. But you see that the red dots are the new snapped fish locations. And in a lot of instances, they lay right on top of the aqua greenish dots, which were the original fish locations, meaning that they didn't need to be nudged. If you look at this spot here, you can see here we have the original fish location, and here is that same location slightly nudged so that it fits within the interior raster, which is the dark blue raster. And so what you've got going on here, let me back up a little bit, is you see we've got some holes in our cost raster. These are just small holes that were probably the original polygon wasn't drawn too well. At any rate, you've got this original point which was a little close to that hole, so now we've snapped that point and moved it a little bit further into the interior, and that's just going to make our future analyses run a little bit smoother. Not a big deal, and it's not going to really change the analysis much, but it needs to be done. And from here on out, this file with the snapped fish locations is the one that we're going to be used in the future analyses. Let's go ahead and save, and we're ready to move on to the next tool. Let's go ahead and turn off the original point file of fish locations because we're not going to use it anymore. We can turn off the interior raster. We're not going to use it anymore. And let's go to the toolbox. Our next step is get path residence times. So this is the point where the tool is going to calculate the least cost path from location to location. And so let's double click that. The feature class we need to input is this fish locations that are snapped. The cost raster is the cost raster. For us, it's 1B. It's the raster where all the cells have a value of 1 in this example. So we're saying that the cost is equal across the whole raster. It is not the interior raster. We're not going to use that anymore. All right, we're going to create a new raster with this tool. And we're going to name this raster res time 1. Because what we're doing here is we're creating a raster of residence times. So basically what this tool is going to do is it's going to start with the first fish location, and it's going to calculate the least cost path through the water to the second location. Then it's going to look at how much time was between those locations, which you see is in that column we created way back at the start called tdiff hours. And you see now why we were very careful to name that column tdiff hours, because here's where we're going to use it. So we've got the least cost path. We know how long it took the fish to travel on that path. So what you can do is at each spot on that path, you can estimate how long the fish was in that spot. And that's going to be how we create a new raster of all those residence times. And this is basically the first step to creating what I call the pseudo locations, the locations that exist between two known locations. So let's go ahead and set the workspace again. And this one takes a while to run, so let's let it run and I'll come back when it's done. And we're back. And you see this kind of funky looking new raster that's drawn. That's our raster of residence times. Let's go ahead and save while we're here. And let me try and explain what we're looking at. I'm going to turn this new raster off for a second. Let's look at the table for our fish locations. And I'm going to select the first two. Okay? And you can see that here's the first fish location and here's the second fish location. And they're separated by just over a day. Alright? So let's zoom in on those. So the fish was here at the start of the experiment, and just over a day later we found the fish right here. Recall our discussion earlier of the theory behind this technique, and we're going to assume that the fish swam from this point to this point and nowhere else. Now, in this example, it was most likely a straight line because, again, our cost raster is equal cost through the whole river. But it doesn't always have to be that way. It's the least cost path to get from this point to this point. So later on, when we change the cost raster to say that some places are easier to swim than others, the path might not be a straight line. It's going to be the least cost path. So if I turn on this residence time raster now, you see that this is what the tool calculated as the least cost path, which is as straight a line as you can get when you're working with 25 meter rasters, okay? And you'll recall that it took about 25 hours for the fish to swim along this path. And so what this new raster has done is basically said, given that and assuming that the fish swam at a constant rate, it spent so many hours in each one of these cells before it showed up at this new cell. And if I get my information button, in this first cell of the path, it spent 2.6 hours there. The next cell, it spent 2.6 hours. The next cell, it spent 2.6 hours. In this cell, it spent 3.7 hours, and so on and so forth. And if you summed those up, it'd be very close to the 25 hours that it took to swim between these 2 points. So that's what we're doing with this step. And so that's the first step in creating what I call pseudo locations between these two actual locations. So let's go ahead and zoom back out, save this, and it's on to the next step. Now that we have the raster of residence times, everything else is pretty much straightforward. If we go, we look at tool number 5, is convert path raster to point. So that's exactly what it sounds like. We're just going to take the residence time raster and we're going to convert it to a point shapefile. And I'm going to name this res time points 1. Hit OK. And there you have it. I'm going to turn off the residence time raster now. I'm going to save my project. And here you can see what I consider the pseudo locations. So we zoom back into the first point to the second point, and you see that now we have a number of other points in between these two, and those are meant to represent where we think the fish was when it was between these 2 points. It took the least cost path and swam along that path to this point. But not only that, each of these points has a value for the residence time. And so we have an estimate not only of where the fish was, but for how long it sat there. And again, go back to the theory that we talked about earlier. This is assuming that the fish swims at a constant rate, and it is based upon the least cost path analysis. So it's sort of our best guess of where that fish was during that time when we didn't have a location on it. Well, this gives us a lot more points to use. So now, I'm going to zoom back. We can use all of this information to calculate the home range. So why don't we just go ahead and do that? Back to our last tool, which is Get Home Ranges. So our input file is going to be the residence time points that we just created. Okay? The population field is automatically set to grid code. Let's leave that as a default. We haven't changed anything, so that's the value that we want. Now it's asking for the 50th percentile raster. So now we're talking about the core area that it's going to delineate for this particular fish. We just need to give that raster a name. I'm going to call it P51 for the 50th percentile. And then the 90th percentile is the estimate of the home range. So I'm going to call that P90, lowercase p91. The KDE raster is the actual kernel density estimate raster that's going to be used, and so this raster is going to cover the entire aquatic area that we're studying, and it's basically the probability of finding this fish in any portion of that aquatic area. I'm going to go ahead and just name that KDE 1. The KDE analysis radius I'm not going to change. I think this is the bandwidth, or it's analogous to the bandwidth, and this value seems to work well, so let's just stick with it. The mask, it says it's optional. We don't want it to be optional. We want to use our cost raster as the mask. So again, in this way, it keeps our analysis within the boundaries of the aquatic system by using this cost raster as a mask. And once again, we want to set the workspace to the folder which contains all our files. Everything's good to go. Let's let it run. And now we have our final results. It doesn't look like much now, so let's play with it a little bit. The kernel density raster I'm not going to mess with. I don't really need that right now. The residence time point file, I don't want that. I want to leave my original fish locations on there. I want to clear the two that are selected. Selection, clear selected. I want to make my original fish locations a little bit larger so they're easier to see. I want to come down here now. I've got the 90th percentile and the 50th percentile. Since the 90th percentile is always bigger, I want to drag it under the 50th percentile. And for some reason it gave them the same color, so I want a contrasting color here. I'm going to change the core area to yellow. And now you see our results. So the yellowish area is what we consider the core area. The purplish area, if I turn off the core area, you see the purplish area is just a larger version. That's what we consider the home range for this fish. And if I zoom out, you can see that home and core range are basically restricted to this small area, which makes sense because that's the only place where the fish was found. And so that's it. We have just calculated the core and home area for a fish, but you'll notice that both of those are restricted to within the borders of the aquatic ecosystem. And you'll recall that they're based upon the least cost path of movement between these locations, and it's also based upon the time between locations. And so this is a pretty good estimate of the core and the home range for this particular fish. Very slick, works very smooth. I think the author should be proud. It's a great little tool. Okay, now we're at the point where we've run the tool and we've calculated our core range and our home range, and it works pretty slick. Now let's go and take it to the next step, which is to modify the costs of swimming in this river and to see how that modifies the home range and core range. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the home range and the core range for right now. And I want to just remind you of this shapefile we created, the residence time points, which you can imagine this is sort of the path that the fish took to swim among all these different locations. All right, keep that in mind. So what we're going to do now is we're going to modify the cost raster, and we're going to say that some parts of the river are harder to swim in than others. Again, what you see here, this green raster, our existing cost raster, every cell has a value of 1. So every cell is equally easy to swim in. But let's go ahead and change that. I'm going to turn off the existing cost raster. Now here is the raster of habitats for this portion of the Mississippi River. And I am going to say that some habitats are harder to swim in than others. And maybe that's true, maybe that's not, but that's the point of doing a model like this, is you can ask yourself these questions. Well, what would happen if? Or how does the things change if I change the cost of swimming in some of these habitats? And so, for example, this brown area here, this is what I call a diked habitat. There's a wing dike right there, and this is the slack water behind it. This purplish area is the main channel border. So it's got some flow, but it's not as deep as the main channel, which has high flow and is very deep. And then this would be a side channel over here, and so on and so forth. So let's pretend, just for the sake of argument, that this particular fish species really likes deep, fast water, like what's found in the main channel. And it does not like swimming in other types of water, in the slower water behind a wing dam. Now that might be sort of the opposite of what you expect, but if you think of something like a sturgeon, they tend to like deeper, faster water. But again, this is just a model, so we're trying to see what's going to happen. So what we want to do is make a new cost raster in which the main channel has very low cost, because that's where the fish wants to be, and the other habitats have a very high cost because the fish does not like to swim in those other habitats. So the way we're going to do this is just like we did before. We're going to reclassify. So I'm going to come over here to Spatial Analyst Tools, and I'm going to go to Reclassify. And just as I did earlier, I'm going to reclassify this Pool 24 raster, the one that we're looking at that has all the habitats. You see all the different values that are in this raster. Each one of these is a different habitat. Now we need to figure out which one represents the main channel. So let's go back to our image. The light green is the main channel. We come over here, we see light green is number 3. So if I go to the reclassify tool, number 3 is going to be changed, is going to be given a value of 1 now, because that's the easiest. All these other values represent all the other different habitats, and we're going to say that those are all difficult to swim in. So let's give them a really high value of, say, 10. And I think you can interpret this as they're 10 times more friction. There's 10 times more harder to swim in than this main channel, which gets a 1. I'm not sure if it's exactly a linear comparison like that, but I think it probably is. And this is all relative. These aren't actual units, and this is based mostly upon your understanding of your organism. Mostly, again, this is just modeling. You're trying to see what's going to happen. But you also might have some data that suggests that the fish likes to swim in certain habitats and not other habitats. And then we're going to leave this as no data. Now we're going to give it a new name. And we're going to call this cost rast 2 now. This is our new cost raster. Let her run. And here you see we have a new cost raster. And if you look at the values for this new cost raster, which is up here, they're 1 and 10. The light green is 10, the pink is 1. So although the fish is found over here, this is not where it wants to swim. So we're going to see if having these higher costs influences the least cost path and therefore the home ranges. Now, while I'm here, let me make it clear, you don't have to base this on habitat. You can base these costs on anything that you think is important to that fish. Maybe it's depth, maybe it's water velocity, maybe it's the presence of predators, maybe it's dissolved oxygen. It could be anything. And all you need to do is have a raster of that factor that you think is important, and then you need to be able to change the cost to say that some areas have a higher cost than others. I'm just doing habitat because that's the shapefile I have, and it's the easiest one to understand. But it could be any factor, or it could be any combination of factors. So you could combine a depth raster maybe with an oxygen raster or a velocity raster or something like that, and then use the resulting raster and change the costs of that resulting raster. So there's really a lot of different ways you can combine things to see how they're going to affect the movement of your fish. What we've done here is we've changed the cost, whereas before every habitat had equal cost, now the main channel has much lower cost than all other habitats. So I'm going to rerun the analysis just like I did before. I'm not going to show you all the steps, but we're going to see how that changes the end result on this series of fish locations. Okay, so I have all rerun the tool, and told you I wasn't going to show you the steps, but I will tell you which steps I ran. We created this new cost raster, but we don't need to get a new interior raster. We don't need to snap points to the mask raster. We've already done that, and we're using that same file of fish locations that's been snapped to the interior raster, so we don't need to change any of that. What we need to change is the least cost path, and then the home range is calculated on that. So we needed to rerun step number 4, and then we needed to run 5 and then 6. Those are the steps that I ran. And so first, if you look at the results, here are the residence time points. And this is the least cost path. And you see how it's different. Let me bring up the original one. Here's the original least cost path when all cells had an equal cost. And you see that to get down to these ones that are further south or further downstream, it just took kind of a straight line to get there. But now we're saying that that habitat is much harder to swim through compared to this main channel. And so you see with this new least cost path, all these fish, when they need to, it's modeling that when the fish needed to get to these downstream locations, it chose to use the main channel because that's where it wants to swim. And then it's to get back up to the upstream ones, it swam back and used the main channel again. So you can see how changing that cost changed the least cost path analysis. And again, these are the points that are used to calculate the home range and the core range. So let's look at how the home range and core range changes. First, the original home range and core range. Let me turn off this. Okay, I'm getting a jumbled mess here. Let me drag these up so that you can see them better. I've got a lot of crazy colors now, and so it can get confusing. And let's do this too. So ugly. Okay, so here was our original analysis with equal cost, and you see the core range in yellow and the home range in purple. Now, let's look at the new home range and core range. See how they're different? You see how the new least cost path modified how the software drew the core range, which is light, and the home range, which is a little bit darker blue. And so again, that's what's really cool about this new tool, is that you can take into account several different factors when you're trying to build the home range and the core range. So there's lots of things you can do with this. Hopefully this tutorial has helped you understand how to run it. And good luck and have fun, and I'll talk to you later.